about paper, tons of paper, no digital stuff, just paper, plain paper for a majority of the documents I will be treating. It's about a library that is rather unknown, I think, because it is initially, at least part of it, the major part of it is a personal, individual library, but it has come into the public in recent years. It's called the Library of the Centre Européen d'Études Japonaises d'Alsace, shortened as CEEJA in French. And I'm just giving a preliminary report on that. It also has a Japanese name. There you have it. And the address is presently in Colmar, France, and it's destined to stay there for the foreseeable future. This is the entrance to the building where the books have been assembled for the most part. Not all of the books and the documents are here. They are actually presently scattered on 3 places, but all within the city of Colmar. This is a building that formerly or probably still belongs to the cooperative of wine growers of the Alsace area, because there is a very tight link between, let's say, the commercial, economic, and official world of the Alsace region. So the Département du Haut-Rhin, as it's called, that's the regional authority, is very much behind the promotion of things Japanese, and it has been that way since the 80s, actually. Next to this library building, we find another building which is also destined to be dedicated to an aspect of Japanese culture. This is going to be the Manga Museum of Colmar. Now, as you can see, they like to use the word Europe or European in their name. So they have assumed a kind of European mission, and they hope that this center, a combination of, let's say, commercial, economic ventures and cultural and scholarly ventures, will grow into a major cluster or pole, as the French call it, of Japan in the east of France. This is actually a plan and yeah, an enterprise, a project that has been promoted and cherished since the 1980s. Now, the library consists of 2 major collections. One is the collection of 2 German professors, so in that sense, it is indeed somehow European. Professor Regina Matthias and Professor Erich Power, both are retired now. Matthias was professor of Japanese history at Ruhr Universität Bochum, and Power was professor of Japanese studies at Marburg University. Their collection is estimated to contain about 100,000 volumes. For the major part books, obviously, but also quite a number of periodicals and magazines. Now, this is the Japanologist couple, because they are indeed married and they have been involved in a kind of avocation or on the side hobby job, that is collecting books, acquisition of books for more than 40 years, actually. Now, Professor Matthias has distinguished herself as a specialist of Japanese social and economic history in a very broad sense. But major topics of research in her case are the history of mining in Japan, the emergence of a middle-class society in modern Japan, and the history of everyday life. In German, they call that Alltagsgeschichte. That's a very important notion in German scholarship, and also with Professor Matthias. Now, Professor Power, who has been trained mainly in Vienna University, is a specialist in the history of science and technology in Japan in the late Edo and early Meiji periods. That again, from especially a social and a sociological point of view, not so much a technological or technical approach, but a sociological approach. That's why he also devotes a lot of his time and research to the development of education and training of engineers, for instance, in Meiji Japan. And he has a huge collection of biographies of Japanese engineers. That's something I have not found in other European libraries so far. Now, they have a description of their a more extensive outline of their research and achievements in a newsletter they have published, and I think it is accessible on the internet. It's called a newsletter, unsurprisingly. So you can find more about their achievements in that publication. Now, their collection has a history of more than 40 years, and it consists of, on the one hand, acquisitions paid for by themselves, but also a lot, and for the majority, collected and received from donations, mainly Japanese donations. And donations started in the 1970s. That's when, of course, no internet was even conceived in those days, perhaps among a few specialists it was, but not among the Japanological community. And in the 70s, I remember myself, books held a kind of absolute status. There was even a kind of competition, I remember, among scholars to acquire the rarest book, not so much in terms of antiquarian value, but in terms of unique, unconventional, different topic. Anyway, so they were very strong at collecting this kind of and soliciting this kind of donations, and they received donations from various scholars, mainly in the field of history and sociology, from Keio University, Hosei University, Kyushu, Nihon Daigaku, Kyoto Daigaku, and various other places. Also institutional research outfits like the, outfits that were devoted to the study of sociological and economical phenomena and had many official documentations and many, hibaihin, so no commercial application, no commercial publications were given to them. There are many, actually, it is a kind of testimony to many personal scholarly libraries. I can't name all of them. One of the first was Inuma Jiro, who was a specialist of agrarian history and of social civic movements and anti-established movements in the 1970s. But major publications by donations by famous scholars are certainly the ones that were given them by Hayami Akira, who is a well-known demographical specialist. He is sort of the founder of historical demography in Japan, and Hidemura Senzo, who was the supervisor of Matthias back at Kyushu University and who is a social historian. Now, collecting all these books from Japan, of course, involves a good deal of logistical work, and Power has distinguished himself as a masterly and a very ingenious specialist in logistics. So he had all kinds of, he established networks with expedition companies and haulage companies that connected between Hamburg and Japan, and by doing this he was able to ship huge amounts of books at fairly low cost back to Germany, where he collected them in Hamburg and carried them back to his home near Marburg in his own personal car. Actually, he spared no effort, probably even not much money, so he spent a lot of money on these things, but that way their collection steadily grew. And at first they collected in their own house, but then of course the books were everywhere. They ousted the cars from the garage and so on, so the books were just everywhere, so they had to rent space from a savings bank branch in the neighborhood and some other disused workshops and so on. So in the end, they were looking for a permanent and steadfast and reliable recipient of their library. And well, selling them, of course, was not a possibility, not an option, because much of it was a donation. So, and no universities or other institutions were interested in taking the whole thing. They were very picky and were only willing to identify special parts within the library. So that would have meant the breakup of their huge collection assembled over 40 years. But in the end, and luckily, they found CEEJA, which is this institute in Colmar. And finally, they could move into the premises where they are now, and where you can see here how the books have been put on stacks. And that's more or less the present situation. I give you a few slides to give an idea of the space and the volume of this library. So they have now, for the time being, about 40 rows of this kind of stacks with their own collection orderly arranged there. So physically it is classified, but it still has to be it still has to get codes, and it still has to be input into the Naxos. But they are a member of Naxos, but this cataloging still has to be done. So there's a lot of work to be done. That's why I call my presentation a preliminary report. Many books are still actually waiting. Hundreds of boxes are still waiting to be unpacked and arranged among the stacks. Now, apart from what you have seen now, there's another depot within the city where they have their journals, periodicals, and magazines. They have a large collection of that too, and they have about now 160 titles on running subscription of scholarly journals. But on top of that, they also have non-subscribed magazines, and magazines that are not scholarly but still interesting. For instance, Kurashi no Techo, which is important for the study of daily life, the Alltag, as they call it in German, in post-war Japan. Matthias told me, for instance, that at one point she studied the, let's say, the way that Japanese women got familiarized with the bra, because the bra was not a fixture of traditional Japanese culture. It only became generally accepted after the Second World War, and you can't find anything about that in lofty scholarly journals. You have to go back to these magazines that sort of teach women how, you know, urban modern life has to be conceived. That so from collections like this Kurashi no Techo, she could trace the history of the introduction and universal spread of what was something initially very unfamiliar to the Japanese, i.e. the bra, which in itself, of course, is a braja, which is a loan from English, but even in English, it's a loan from French. So there is some unfamiliarity in many cultures about this fixture of modern life. Now, the journals collection is particularly strong in the areas of law, economics, and society. Culture and history are less well represented. Again, many of these journals are paid for by themselves on subscription, but still they have a lot also that they have received. You see here Mr. Power among his journals, and his wife also making a check in the depot of scholarly journals. Now, here again, many boxes are still awaiting unpacking. These stacks contain all kinds of journals, periodicals, including general magazines, which, as I said, are informative when you study the Alltag of Japanese modern life. Now, this is a collection of Kurashi no Techo. She actually, Professor Matthias is quite glad and proud on this collection. She has the earlier series complete, and then the later ones are not complete, but this was actually a donation from a Japanese artist. And so she used it actually for her research, one of her many researches, that is. Now, that's the Kurashi no Techo section. Another section that is very important in their collection is actually the books and studies and documentation related to the relationship between German-speaking countries and Japan. About 2,000 books they have from the 18th century to the present, all kinds of studies, academic and more of a general nature, travel reports, diplomatic sources, an extremely diverse range of literature and periodicals. But what is more than that, they also have many, many photographs and other documents. And a previously neglected field is probably mainly interesting for German language scholars, but still the so-called Japan novels. So that is a kind of novels that was written in German about Japan, a kind of fictitious, imaginary Japan, and also translations into other languages from German as far as they were available. Now, also particularly noteworthy is the documentation and the photographs relating to German prisoners of war in Japan during the First World War. And also, of course, testimonies from the period of the so-called German-Japanese friendship between nations during the Third Reich, and books, documents, and objects relating to Richard Zorge, the famous German journalist who spied for the Soviet Union in Japan during the Second World War. Now, this is a view of a small section of, one range of shells from the German-Japanese relationship section. Also, they have some antiquarian books, but that's not actually their focal point. But one very interesting antiquarian book is this one, that is the first Western translation of a Japanese novel, actually, by Fitzmyer, dating from 1847. That's an Austrian polymath, an Austrian scholar, self-taught linguist, and so on, a man of great ability. And he published in 1847, that is, a German translation of a book by Ryutei Tanehiko. So this is generally accepted as, or recognized as, the first Western translation of a literary Japanese work. Important also is the typographical feat that was realized by Fitzmyer. So he actually made movable types for printing Japanese hiragana and katakana, which was used in the official Hofdruckerei, so the printing office of the Austrian Empire. Now, another section, very important in their collection, is that on the history of mining in Japan, another of Matthias's research topics. It's probably unique in Europe. It comprises books and documents on Japanese mining, which at least in Japanese and European Japanology has been rather a neglected sector of the Japanese economy. Now, Japan is nowadays often portrayed as a country without natural resources, but it appears that ore and later coal mining played an important role in the history of Japan and even in the history of its East Asian neighbors. So she has been focusing on this aspect of Japanese history, economic history, social history, and that's, I think, also a major contribution. And it has defined the content and the composition of their library. So in these respects, where these two people are specialized, I think their library and their collection is fairly unusual and unique within Europe. So that's another point I would like to draw attention to. This is just one shot of the section on mining history in their library, but it's huge what they have and very rare. They have, not in terms again of antiquarian books, but in terms of research that otherwise you have to go to Japan to find. Typical for Power is his attention and his interest in the Japanese engineering. And he has, for instance, a collection of Ohara Junnosuke. That's a quite unknown engineer, but it is a typical Meiji engineer. And so studying this man is actually very important to know how early Meiji period engineering developed and came into its own, because he was able to lay hands on handwritten lecture notes, internship reports and diaries of this Ohara Junnosuke, dating from the early days of modern Japanese engineering education. He did not live long, but maybe that's also the reason why much of his notes and reports and so on have been preserved, and so they were eventually sold to an antiquarian. But in the end, he could lay hands on this collection, and it's now in Colmar, and he is actually present studying this. It's very important to know how engineering education actually worked in the early days of Meiji. Now, this is a range of memoirs and actually memoirs of engineers. That again, as you can see, many of these books are blue because they are actually photocopies that he made in Japan of how to find articles and books on these engineers, and he nicely bound them and gave them a nice cover so that they are easy to handle and easy to retrieve. Now, so I have now described in short their collection. This collection had to be integrated into a pre-existing collection, namely the one at CEEJA. So they had to ship their 100,000 volumes from their home to Colmar. Now, CEEJA was a pre-existing fixture. The Centre Européen d'Études Japonaises d'Alsace had been founded around 2001 by Jean-Jacques Ohridski, who is a Japanologist from Paris, and André Klein, who is a local administrator and enlightened bureaucrat, so and a learned bureaucrat, I can say. So this CEEJA defines itself as an important transnational forum for scientific, cultural, and economic exchange with Japan. And from the outset, it saw as one of its main missions the constitution of a so-called Japan library. Of course, they were short of money, as everyone is short of money. So when the German Japanologists appeared with their 100,000 volumes, Klein and the CEEJA were apparently delighted to accept them and integrate them into their own library, thus making a collection of about 135,000 volumes. Now, of course, all these books had to be stacked on shelves and so on, so they had to apply for funding, and they got funding by Japanese foundations, the Japan World Exposition Commemorative Fund in Osaka and the Toshiba International Foundation in Tokyo. Now, of course, now remains the integration of one of the major tasks of these people is the integration of these two collections. And so they are quite busy with them, but I first have to say a few things about the pre-existing collection, which was fairly sizable as well, around 30 or 35,000 volumes, and they actually derived from a Japanese boarding school secondary education institution that was established in the 1980s. That was, of course, before the bubble burst, and there was a lot of money going around, and many Japanese companies were interested in setting up shop in Europe, and Alsace showed itself to be a very welcoming environment. So many Japanese firms actually put up Genchi Hojin, so subsidiaries in Alsace. And of course, these people, the Japanese who came with these companies, they had children, and their children had to go to school. So they put up a lycée CEEJA d'Alsace, Alsace CEEJA Gakuen. Now, they apparently, it's clear they had quite some money, because they collected a very beautiful library, I must say. Perhaps more from an education than a scholarly perspective, that is true. But even so, many are compilations of high quality, serious, and so on, which reflect more or less the state of science at the time of compilation. So that's the lycée, the Alsace CEEJA Gakuen. So what did it contain? Well, if you run through the stacks, then you find all kinds of series and compilations, which I have listed some of them here. Not many G10, many reference works, but multi-volume reference works that were no doubt state of the art in the 80s, 90s, or the former century, the previous century. Also, the collected works of many famous Japanese writers of Meiji, Taisho, and Showa, and a large section on classical literature, also in multi-volume sets. So, and also interesting, Japanese translations of a host of famous Western writers as well: Shakespeare, Goethe, Stendhal. And what is very striking is that all these books, nearly all these books, are in pristine condition. I would say mint condition, so they haven't been used a lot. But anyway, so the task ahead is the confluence and the integration of these two selections. So Matthias has been named vice president of this CEEJA. So they have been integrated institutionally in this French fixture, and they are actually officially now the caretakers of the whole collection, the huge fund of books, periodicals, documents, and other types. So merging the two, that's the task ahead. Now, of course, they have to use a classification system, and this classification system they have developed is actually one they had developed for themselves, and now they have to expand it and to encompass the whole collection. And it's based on the alphabet, the first range, I mean, the basic range of categories is actually the alphabet. The CEEJA Gakuen use the NDC, so they have to solve the problem of how to integrate these, but they have made a concordance table between the two so that it's easy to find one's way through these temporarily and for the time being dual collections. Now, apart from this scholarly library, because it is to all intents and purposes a scholar library, they also have an antiquarian library, the Edo Bunko. It consists of about 500 titles. Many of them are illustrated books, some of them are colored, and they were acquired with an eye to representing, again, the everyday life of the populace. So it's not that they were after the most expensive and the finest samples and specimens of, big and valuable antiquarian items, but they wanted to give an idea of how the people related to published works and printing in the Edo period. You can see here a few photographic impressions of the kind of books that they have collected. There has been a Hata Yuki, who is a friend of Fuserie-san, okay, sorry. She has made a mokuroku, an inventory, and apparently Huse-san tells me just now that she's secured additional funding to continue inventorying and cataloging this Edo Bunko, which is also quite an interesting set of books. My predecessor, Professor Miyamoto, talked about shohon, jewelry, shohon, and things like that. Of course, in their collection, they also have some but very much used samples of keikobon and little booklets that contain the text of chapters of jewelry. They also have other collections. I cannot go into them, but I just want to draw your attention to their existence. For instance, a collection of coins and banknotes, also interesting. And so to conclude, in terms of provenance, it is actually a mosaic of large and small acquisitions, donations, and purchase books. Because the books often stem from private collections, not bookshops, the library in a sense is also a heritage library, testifying to the scholarship of the previous century, half century at least, and even beyond. It is unique in the sense that few personal libraries of scholars were expanded so deliberately and orderly into one of institutional size. It easily equals the size of the major European centers of Japanese studies. I'm not saying that it's the biggest library of Japanese studies in Europe, but it is certain that many libraries of Japanese studies in Europe are smaller than this one. Now, the future is, of course, to make all this accessible. First of all, make sure that all books in the collection are accessible, or at least can be retrieved through the internet. They are a member of Naxos, and so that in the future, in the foreseeable and long future, people will go on even in the coming generations to access and use this valuable resource. I want to conclude with this. The floor is open for questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. You mentioned briefly that there are documents from the First World War of the German prisoners of war in Japan. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit more about this collection? If you know, is it just Vande or also other?
Yeah, I think there is a more important one in Freiburg. No, sorry, in Würzburg. Someone by the name of Andreas Mettenleitner. Yeah, he has published a book. Mm-hmm. So in the Siebold Center in Würzburg, they have apparently a collection of at least photographs and probably also letters and so on. Yeah, letters as well from German prisoners of war in the First World War in Japan. Now, in this case, I was also a little bit surprised to be told, but I haven't really gone through them because I made a fairly short visit. And as you can see, it actually does take a lot of time to go through all this. So I have to take their word for this because also at the Edo Bunko, I went through a few items, but they have, I think, about what they have ordered 37 special different categories of Edo period publications in the Edo Bunko. So let's say exploring even cursorily the whole collection, I have not been able to do that. I did not have the time. So I did not have a look at this. I actually have to take their word for it. That's why also I've called it a preliminary report, because I hope that they themselves, once they have progressed in their cataloging activities, that they can make a presentation of their own, because of course they are the insiders. So I don't know how well stuffed and how well provided they are in relationship with this item. I don't know.
I hadn't known about it, but I can contact Professor.
Yes, yes.
Matthias,
Oh, yes. Actually,
directly.
of
No
course, they
problem.
are very. Yes, I should say that. Of course, since the books are physically arranged, so it's actually quite easy to use, but you have to be on the spot there. So you can't apply for a book that would then be sent to you through Blauer Leihverkeers, for instance. They don't do that for the time being.
Yeah.
So once everything will be accessible on an input into Naxos, they may change their idea about that. But for the time being, you have to go there. But you can go anytime. They are available on hand anytime you want. You just have to tell them beforehand that you are coming, because of course they're not waiting there for you to come. But
that
tell
would
them.
have been my second question. How can you use it? Is it open to the public? But okay, if you just
Yes, so for the time being,
service.
but they are living in Colmar, and they are actually devoting much of their time to the library. So they are available nearly every day.
Okay. Let's close here. If you have any further questions, please approach Professor Van der Walle during the break or elsewhere. So thank you very much for your presentation.